It's 4 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do you remember Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian woman who died in police custody after being arrested over a headscarf violation? And there was a moment where it looked as though the widespread protests over women's rights and against the Iranian theocracy, the extremist religious government of Iran, it looked for a moment as if it might topple, as if the weight of public fury, public heartbreak, public protest would possibly do what successive efforts have failed to do and topple the Iranian theocracy. I don't know why my mind turned to that this morning. I really don't know why. I just think that the notion of removing the hideous regime in Tehran is at the forefront of all of our minds in a way. And the reason that I mention that first this morning is because the starting point for today's conversation will be a reminder, not just of the hideousness of Hezbollah, but the hideousness of Iran. The symmetry of sympathy that we've talked about a lot on the program, the absence of a symmetry of support in international terms, is a very, very, very different conversation today from the ones that we were having almost a year ago. But I'm not an expert on any of this, and I'm not really capable of plotting exactly what all of the differences are. But it is almost a year to the day that we sat here and contemplated the atrocity visited upon Israeli civilians on October the 7th, an atrocity that left 1,200 of them dead. There have already been more than 1,200 deaths in Lebanon since then. The figure is estimated to be 2,000. But the symmetry of sympathy doesn't take that into account. That one death is a tragedy to whomever it occurs. And I appreciate that a lot of people heavily invested in all of these issues find it kind of hard to accept that or to acknowledge that. You have to believe in the sort of hierarchy of humanity in order to subscribe to some of the positions that get an awful lot of prominence in this discussion. But the question of proportionality is back, and I don't know quite what to do with it. I remember thinking in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel, I remember thinking that Israel has the right to go, biblical would be an unfortunate word to use, wouldn't it? Ballistic is possibly a better one, although, of course, that has a double meaning, and it was a ballistic attack upon Israel that Iran undertook yesterday. But I remember thinking in the immediate aftermath, as we learnt the details of the horrors that had been visited upon entirely innocent people at a music festival that day, I found myself framing the thought that Israel has been handed the right to go ballistic in Gaza. A position that I held for days, if not weeks. And then for many of us, but not all, I acknowledge that, a pendulum reached its midpoint, and the sense that the response had now outweighed the provocation became, for me, impossible to resist, and I will never apologize for that. The idea that the right of response that Hamas had handed Israel, a response, by the way, that Hamas must have known was coming. So Hamas's contempt for the ordinary people of Gaza can never be factored out of this conversation or ignored, any more than Hezbollah's contempt for the ordinary people of Lebanon can be left out of discussions about the latest chapter in this hideous saga. But for me and for many other people, if you attempt at objectivity, you have to acknowledge the point past where the feeling was this has gone too far now. And then you dug into the questions of why nobody was staying the hand of Benjamin Netanyahu. And the answer was that the support of the very far-right members of his own cabinet was absolutely intrinsic to his political survival and quite possibly his judicial freedom. And that situation continues to unfold. It's not that long ago, of course, that the killing of 5 hostages in tunnels under Gaza was seen as an epic failure of Netanyahu's regime. And attention has been very, very effectively distracted, moved. Even a major Israeli trade union called a strike in response to that in an attempt to shame the government or damage the government. But that ship has sailed. The attention shifts inexorably now towards one of Israel's other borders. And then you come to this question again. Israel will pay for what happened last night. I want to ask you two questions in a way, what that payment will be and what that payment should be. Because I think that we let ourselves down a bit in the aftermath of the October the 7th attack by not being a little bit more careful with specifics. You know, I was thinking of the King Lear quote on the moor when he's gone mad, when he talks about, I will do such things. What they are, I know not, or words to that effect. Don't at me. It's not a GCSE. It's like the sense of an unleashed fury, but no definition of target. And what we have seen subsequently there has been horrific, every bit as horrific as the events of October the 7th. And of course, if you are capable of any form of symmetry of sympathy, then the deaths of 40,000 people, or however many of them turn out to be civilians, return us to comparisons. I don't even know how helpful they are on days like today. Did I just say Iraq instead of Iran? Iran will pay. I do apologize. I may have said Iran instead of Israel. You know, the harder I try to choose my words really carefully, the more sometimes I leave myself open to sausages moments, as Keir Starmer probably doesn't call them. So Iran will pay is the mantra of Benjamin Netanyahu this morning. And the reason I'm drawing some parallels, albeit that many of them are dangerous, with October the 7th, is because I can't argue with that. Of course Iran will pay. You can't fire 200 missiles into civilian areas without inviting a helpful pun, a ballistic response. I don't know how much it matters to you or to the sort of objective moral compass that the world seemed to have lost years ago, how, quotes, successful, end quotes, the attacks were. Symmetry of sympathy becomes really tricky. It even begins to sound a little bit simplistic when you compare, if you like, the death toll, the death count. But I am more frightened of being killed than I have of being compelled to take cover, relatively secure in the knowledge that I'm not going to be blown to smithereens. But I'm still not underestimating how traumatic and horrible it must be to flee for your life from a threat that is real, albeit that your government, with the support of America and the United Kingdom and many other allies, is almost certain to blast that threat out of the skies before it can do any harm to you and yours. But you can't fire missiles at a country and expect not to be attacked in return. And that's where we are this morning. Iran will pay. And that, I think, is why I started the programme, by remembering Mahsa Amini. Because for the massive, massive, massive majority of Iranians, I mean, they lose from both ends. They're going to come under attack from Israel, and they hate the governing regime that's fired the missiles at Israel in the first place. So symmetry of sympathy becomes even more urgent, doesn't it? Even more valuable. And then you have the other question, the really weird one, which would be, if, like me, you felt that this time last year Israel had been handed by Hamas the right to respond on a biblical scale in a ballistic fashion, how's that worked out? Honestly, how's that worked out? This idea that's been in place from the very start, that you would somehow eradicate. It's like Medusa, you know, like you chop off one snake and two more grow back. That's right, isn't it? That was the Hydra, I think, or one of the monsters of Greek mythology. The idea that you could chop off everything and somehow neutralize, nullify, remove the threat forever, for generations, whatever it may be. How's that worked? Should somebody have sat here a year ago and urged Israel not to respond at all? don't know. I couldn't have done that. But in response to, I think, as things stand, no deaths. There was a terror attack in Israel yesterday, but I don't think, as far as I'm aware, the Iranian attempted bombardment has left anybody dead. I'll correct that immediately if the facts have changed or the facts do change in the course of this morning's programme. But if 40,000 deaths is an acceptable price to pay for the murder of 1,200 Israeli civilians, what is an acceptable price to pay for the murder of none? And if 40,000 deaths is an unacceptable price to pay for the murder of 1,200 civilians, then what is the correct price to be exacted by Israel from Iran for the killing of none, as far as we know? And I don't know. I don't know. But I don't know that any of the key players want peace. It's just plebs that want peace, isn't it? It's just ordinary people. It's just people who run the risk of being murdered in custody for wearing their headscarf wrong that want peace. I don't know. So, what do you think it means when Benjamin Netanyahu says that Iran will pay? Question number 1, 0345 6060 973. And what price do you think should be paid by Iran and Iranian people? Because however, quotes, limited, end quotes, the attacks may be, however, quotes, careful to avoid civilian casualties, end quotes, the IDF may profess to be, we know what happens. We know what happens. Children are already dead in Lebanon. You know, that's how careful it is. That's how limited the attacks are. And Iran looks set to follow. So I don't know. All I do know is that some of the key players, some of the big names, appear to be dedicated to this continuation of carnage. And I don't know how it stops. But I'm not sure that visiting carnage upon Iran now. So what would be better? It would be perhaps, here's a phrase that you rarely cite on the positive side of any scale. Maybe they should just confine their attacks to potential nuclear sites, because blowing up nuclear sites, that's not risky at all. And to whom would the greatest risk be posed? Iranian civilians. So I couldn't sit here a year ago and to say that I don't think Israel should respond biblically or ballistically. A lot of people got very upset with me for saying that. A lot of people who subsequently got very upset with me for having a moral compass with an arrow that moves were very delighted with me for saying that Israel has the right to respond in an incredibly robust fashion. But that's my job. That's the smallish burden that I carry. Is that if you reserve the right to change your mind as the facts change, then you earn the enmity of people who are incapable of changing their minds as the facts change. So when I said what I said about Israel a year ago, it upset an awful lot of people who've subsequently been encouraged by what I've said about Israel's overreaction or Israel's unacceptable or unjustifiable actions in Gaza. But there were 1,200 people dead in a terrorist attack when I said that. So what is a reasonable price to exact from Iran for the actions of last night? Because that is the question to which the world now turns its attention. 0345 6060 973. I don't know that today's a day for showing you how mad the responses are to the conversation that you've just heard and how people are capable of hearing completely different things from what you have just heard. But I would remind you that the question is pretty simple. What price should Iran pay for the events of last night? That's it. I don't know if anyone can answer. I don't know really what the answer will be. But I can't wait to hear what you think. It's 19 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. I suppose, war being war, the question of what should happen as opposed to what is it going to achieve, is a little bit moot at moments like this. If London had been under attack last night and we were preparing to retaliate, I don't know that many of us would be worrying about what the situation would look like 2 weeks, 2 months or 2 years from now. We would just be feeling the necessity of response, retaliation, revenge. Pick your favourite R. And I fully recognise that. But I do still wonder what the price that Iran will now pay should be. And I don't know. Tony's in Lewisham. Tony, what do you think?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
I don't think we can have this conversation talking about what price Iran should pay unless we talk about what price Israel should pay for what they've done. Let's not forget, they launched a strike within Iran to kill, I think it was the Hamas leader.
That was... Okay, yeah, all right, yeah. I mean,
that wasn't too long ago.
Confusing, but a Hamas leader is a completely legitimate target.
Yeah, but it's on foreign soil. Just like Iran sending missiles to Israel on foreign soil, they've launched attacks on foreign soil in Iran. They've launched attacks in Syria, and Lebanon. They continue to do what they're doing in Palestine. People say that this situation is complicated. It's not really complicated. You can't, because if you're only going to address the problem and not the cause, then the situation will continue. It's very simple.
I'm not sure. Well, I'll have a go at making it less simple, although you may not thank me for it, and you may not agree. So, the concept of self-defense is key to the conundrum that you describe, and Hamas and Hezbollah are dedicated to damaging or destroying Israel. So any action that Israel takes in response to those two organizations and now to Iran is self-defense, which is why Western leaders like Joe Biden and yesterday Keir Starmer can talk about defending Israel's right to self-defense. You can only really cite self-defense against a clear and present danger, against an attack, and that is what Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran represent to Israel. Israel does not represent a clear and present threat to them, except in acts.
Really?
Yes, really. Because all the things you've mentioned are acts of, technically, are acts of self-defense. They are responses to provocations. The terror attack.
Right, so for the past 50 or how many years since the after the Second World War, when Israelis went in and stole Palestinian land, so everything that's been happening to the Palestinians.
Now you're showing why you think it's simple. Because it isn't. The Israelis didn't go in and steal Palestinian land. If you're referring to the occupation, you're talking about 1967, which wasn't after the Second World War. That was after Israel was attacked and in response took territory which it has subsequently not surrendered to the countries that attacked Israel. So it's categorically not simple. And you can't ignore I'm
not condoning anything. I'm not condoning.
No, but you're describing it as simple, and you're asking why Israel is not attacked for its attacks, and the answer is, it's a little bit like the Fawlty Towers sketch about who invaded Poland. The answer is that Israel is acting in self-defense against these three entities. For me, the unjustifiable...
that they are acting in self-defense. I do not condone...
It's the civilian casualties that become morally indefensible for me, Tony. This is where you and I suspect, converge upon at least some shared territory. It's what they like to call collateral damage, which appears to have two different meanings. So they want a symmetry of warfare when they're talking about their right to attack Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, and thankfully, hopefully, the civilian casualties in Iran won't be comparable to the proportion of civilian casualties in Gaza because of the nature of military installations in Iran. But if a terrorist talks about collateral damage, it's terrorism. If an army talks about collateral damage, it's war. Perhaps that's the imbalance you're trying to describe. I don't know.
You need to look at the definition of terrorism, because terrorism, it's defined. I see in the Western world, terrorism is defined based on bias. Now, there's members of the Israeli government who, correct me if I'm wrong, they've been convicted of
terror offences.
Yeah. So why are they not classed as terrorists as well?
It's a question of international law. And again, you know, that supports your point, because some elements of international law Israel has historically chosen to ignore, or indeed to dismiss the probity of the bodies that sit in judgment. Technically, it's unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. So technically, you can deflate that with the self-defense argument as well, because if it's self-defense, it's not in pursuit of political aims, it's in pursuit of self-defense. So,
well, who's standing up for the Palestinians and for their right for self-defense? Nobody.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Well, no,
the Western Britain and America, all they say is no.
You mean defense? You mean self-defense against occupation, against illegal occupation, as opposed to self-defense against lethal attacks, and that there I have no beef. I have no argument with you. I have no argument with you here. The question,
being slaughtered.
No, we veered a lot from the question that we're trying to address today. But what constitutes, in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of Israel or in the eyes of Israel's allies, what constitutes permissible and meaningful resistance of the illegal occupation? That's the question that I've never heard anybody satisfactorily answer, because the hop from recognising that they're not allowed to do anything to defend their corner or defend their cause, the hop from that to the justification of terrorism is quite short, but it's a hop I will never take, Tony. I'm
not saying they cannot do anything to defend themselves, but like when you look, this is not proportional whatsoever.
No.
Because Israel, they're a very rich country. They have some of the most advanced weapons systems in the world.
Yeah.
They know whatever they do, like even though their so-called allies can tell them, please show restraint, please stop.
Yeah.
Whatever they do, if they come under attack, like Britain, America will jump to their defense. So
while simultaneously asking them to stop.
Yeah.
Which is madness. I agree with you. So here's a question. Here's a question for you. Why has Iran done what it's done when the reaction is so obviously predictable?
Because their allies are being absolutely slaughtered. Like Muslim people within that region.
Iran slaughters Muslim people for fun. Iran kills people for wearing their headscarf wrong. Muslim people. So that doesn't work. Why has Iran done what they must know will bring about more death of innocent Iranian, Palestinian, Lebanese civilians? Why have they done what they've done? Because they want war as much as everybody else in the mix wants war. Because it suits them. It sustains their power base.
When you're backed into a corner...
Iran isn't backed into a corner. Well, Iran's a theocracy, mate. It's a medieval regime. Where I think homosexuals still get stoned in Iran. They're not backed into a corner. They've got a stranglehold on the windpipe of an entire population, and a population that is oppressed in ways that we in the West can barely imagine.
Okay, but
so why have they done what they've done?
They've been strangled with sanctions. They really don't have much to lose at the end of the day.
Well, except the lives of civilians. I think you've accidentally made my point for me. They care no more about the lives of Iranian civilians than some of the people who like to write their names on the side of missiles that are heading into Arab territories. It is 10:30. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 33 minutes after 10. Listen to these two texts, one from Anna, one from Patrick, and perhaps get a clearer picture of the tightrope that those of us who refuse to base our emotional responses to the death of another human being upon that human being's ethnicity or religion, the tightrope that we try to walk. So Patrick writes, I hate this argument that Israel isn't allowed to defend itself because it's more technologically advanced and has the Iron Dome to prevent missile strikes. Going by that logic, people could take shots at the president of the USA's limo because it's bulletproof without any repercussions. It's lunacy. And then Anna writes, I think we're having a lot of issues with the self-defense part of all this. I disagree completely on what the premise of self-defense is. You have the right to shoot somebody that enters your house who doesn't belong there. It's self-defense, full stop. But if you follow that person back to their home and shoot them, that is not self-defense. The Iron Dome is self-defense, but following people back to their home to try to kill that person in their own country and everyone else in their home or nearby, that's committing an atrocity within inside the other country's borders. I don't think that self-defense thought things, that's where people have a lot of problems with what Israel is doing. Yeah, but what if you were confident that if you didn't follow them home and kill them, then they would be back in your house tomorrow night? So you can make a case. Patrick is persuasive, Anna is persuasive, and they're completely at odds with each other. The bit on which I would stick my flag is the bit where you demand absolutely painstaking attention to avoiding civilian death. And I'm afraid my conviction, my profound belief is that although Israel insists, and Israel's loudest supporters insist that it does that, that is an insistence entirely at odds with all available evidence. And that's not an opinion, that's counting. 10:35 is the time. So Iran will pay. Iran will pay. I don't think you can describe the firing of 180 missiles into Israel as an act of self-defense. A couple of you are telling me that they have, although James says, is that a sign of a sense of humour? Unlikely on the part of the theocracy in Iran. Yeah, humorless doesn't even come close. But it highlights the difficulty of pinning down precisely what self-defense is. If someone poses a threat to you, but it's a hollow threat, and you track them down and kill them, is that an act of self-defense? There's nothing hollow about 200 missiles flying above your airspace, but if you were to measure the threat on a scale of 1 to 10, where would it have to reach to justify killing civilians in response? I mean, I don't know. That's just why I'm asking you. Ahmed is in Swansea. Ahmed, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
Hi there, long-time listener. Right, so I just wanted to answer your basic question of if Israel should respond. I personally don't believe that Israel has the right to respond. What I would contest is the fact that people are calling it self-defense. I don't think it is self-defense from Iran, that is. I think it was just a response to the last 2 weeks, the attacks in Lebanon, the attacks on Hezbollah, the assassination of Nasrallah. Obviously, these are setbacks for the Iranian government, and they must have been under a lot of pressure to respond. And I think it was a very calculated response. I'm hearing in the media.
Well, it wasn't. It can't have been that calculated, can it? Because it is almost certainly going to unleash.
That's what that's the main thing I'm thinking as well.
Yeah.
But then, when you think about it, then
unless that was the calculation, in which case we're back to Iran inviting terror to be inflicted on its own people.
But that's the thing. I don't think they believe that Israel's going to inflict terror upon them. They believe the US might be able to hold them on a leash.
Do you?
If you look at the way Biden was speaking yesterday, he was basically saying that it was a completely failed attack, and it's in a sense that's giving
Biden is doing the Albert Einstein misquote, isn't he? He's doing the same thing over and over again in the hope of getting a different result. So he's saying, please stop, please stop, please stop, have some bombs. Please stop, please stop, please stop, have some more bombs. I just don't, I mean, you might be right. That might be what Biden thinks, but I don't think I do.
I don't know. And also it's the fact that the US gave a warning just beforehand. Yes. So that gives the inclination that maybe Iran spoke to the US and told them, like, this is what we're about to do.
More likely to be intelligence, but it does attempt to diffuse the impact in the hope of minimising the response. But this is doing the same thing over and over again in the hope of getting a different result, Ahmed. Understand the makeup of Netanyahu's cabinet and indeed his motivation and the likelihood of them dialing it down because they got early warnings, because the attack was so unsuccessful, because almost all of the ordnance was blown out of the sky before it could hurt anybody. You think logically all of those things point towards a successful plea to Benjamin Netanyahu to go easy on Iran. There is nothing from the last 12 months that suggests he's ever going to go easy on anyone when the mood is upon him.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you there. The only bit I would contest is the fact that all the ordnance was blown out of the sky, because from what we're seeing, there's a lot of footage going around from initial media and people recording what was going on. And from what it looked like is that the Iron Dome was penetrated and that a lot of missiles did land. Now, where they landed and what they affected, we're not going to know.
Well, we'd know if people had been killed. We would.
That's the difference, though. That's the measure of difference here. The Israelis and the people supporting the regime in Israel, they're measuring things by casualties. Whereas we're not the normal people. What I would say is the moral side of it. It's not about like the deaths of people. So when we see like one person getting killed, that is a moral outrage. It doesn't, and for them, they can drop a 2,000 pound bunker buster bomb to kill one man and kill lots of civilians, and then for them that's power. But from other perspective, I would say just the fact of being able to say we've penetrated your Iron Dome, the thing that keeps you safe, we've managed to land a missile.
We've done that before.
That's a deterrent.
Yeah, but I mean, I wonder if you're being too logical about this, and that adds to the idea that Iran thinks it's undertaken a calculation, but it's going to prove to be an epic.
I mean, what happened in April then? What happened in April? Because where was the miscalculation there? I believe the Israelis.
Well, they're saying, look, you're not as safe as you think you are.
Yeah, exactly. They're saying,
but that's
the
reason for more attacks on Iran, not fewer.
I respectfully disagree.
Come on, we've got the capability of hurting you. You thought we didn't, so now we're going to hurt you.
Netanyahu's little speech afterwards, when he was speaking about the attack.
Yes.
They had to zoom in. I feel like he was literally shaking. He was shaken because for him, he was under a safe protection. He thought he was riding a euphoria of having killed Nasrallah, having killed all these top leaders. Like, let's forget about all the civilians for a second. For him, he's gone to the Israeli public. His main aim is to get
the Iron Dome is
back.
fallible. But, mate, if anyone thought the Iron Dome was infallible, they wouldn't be using the shelters, would they? They know that it's not fallible, that it's not infallible. I don't think I've misunderstood your point. And, you come from the place of hoping that the Israeli response won't be ballistic in the metaphorical and literal meaning of the word. But I hope you're right, obviously, for the sake of innocent deaths, of which I think the only one we've heard of from yesterday was a Palestinian man killed by an Iranian missile near Jericho. Shrapnel from an Iranian missile killed a Palestinian man. So if you were going to start doing, I mean, who responds to the killing of a Palestinian man by Iran? Who has the right to respond to that? I do not know. Michael is in Modin in Israel. Michael, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Hello, mate. Very well. What's on your mind?
A minute. Let me just... I tell you what. So first of all, let's start on... Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, let's start on a positive note where we both actually agree. I actually came to hear your name through your Brexit debates, and I must say, we saw eye to eye on Brexit.
Okay.
And everything you said with clarity, unbelievable.
Much as I enjoy talking about myself, I think there are bigger issues at play today, Michael. So let's move straight to the meat of the morning, if we may.
So you started out your show today was.
I know what I think. I know what I think, mate. Tell me what you think.
Okay, I think it's very it's not fair, right, for you to belittle the attack of yesterday.
I'm not belittling.
Zero people died.
No, that's not an opinion. That's counting.
Yeah, but you're belittling.
I'm not belittling it. I'm counting.
It was only 0 people died.
No. I've talked about the trauma of having to run for your life, the horrors of being forced to take cover underground, the probably generational trauma of explosions going off over your head. But of course, what I have to do now is compare that to attacks that have actually left children dead in the street. And ask what would be worse. I don't belittle the Israeli experience by pointing out that a dead child is a bigger tragedy than a surviving child. That's all. So let's not fall out about this. That's just obvious.
Every Israeli national, which I am of, is mourned every innocent Palestinian civilian, Lebanese civilian that has died.
Yes, but no one's belittling anything. Let's get back to your central point.
By starting your show and saying X amount of people, 40,000 people died, but no one died yesterday,
yes.
Does belittle the attack.
It doesn't belittle it. It's a statement of fact. If you don't like the fact because you don't like where it leads, that's not my fault. That's a you problem. Okay.
So let's go back to a statement of fact. Why are so few Israelis?
That's a question, not a fact.
From these indiscriminate rockets that have come from Hezbollah, that have come from Hamas, and that now have come from Iran. Why are so few Israelis dying? Because the Israelis take their money and they invest it in air defense systems.
Yes.
Right now, you as a UK taxpayer,
yes.
and you who who paid your UK
I don't want to run out of time before we get to the heart of the point that you're making in response to the question of what price should be exacted from Iran for last night's failed attacks, albeit traumatizing and horrible and terrifying. Ultimately failed, but by everybody's account, up to and including.
It didn't fail. And again, you're belittling the attack.
I think
yesterday's attack.
Okay, mate.
Yesterday's attack.
So, what would a successful attack have looked like?
That was a success to fire 200 ballistic missiles, the most in history.
I don't understand the argument that you're having, but you're not having an argument with me. I don't understand the point that you're making. No,
my point is, you can't be belittling.
I can't keep pointing out that nobody died. Why not?
Serious, massive attack. Now,
why does it upset you to have it pointed out that nobody died? That's a wonderful testament to Israeli policy, to the technology of the Iron Dome. Why does it upset you so much?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't upset me.
But you're literally shouting at me because I keep pointing out that nobody died.
It doesn't upset me.
You sound quite upset.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying. But why do you not open your show and saying the reason why no one died is because of the
Iron Dome?
I
did.
And the air defense.
I did.
The fact that they invest their time, effort, and knowledge into the air defenses.
I did.
Whilst the other side don't.
Michael, I did. Have you got Global Player?
Yes.
You can rewind and listen again. I literally opened the show by saying that.
You opened the show by saying 40,000 people died. What is
because of the Iron Dome, because of the efforts of American and UK allies, because of the jets that have helped shoot the missiles out of the sky. I've said all of that. So in response and out of courtesy, why does it upset you so much for me simply to point out that nobody died last night, except the Palestinian who died near Jericho?
It didn't upset me.
But that's the only thing you've said. You've been on for 5 minutes. You've made no other point except your okay, let me use a better word. Your discombobulation, your unhappiness about the fact that I've pointed out that nobody died. Well, why is that so discombobulating?
But I think you need to be significantly clearer why no one died.
Well, I can't be any clearer. It was the Iron Dome.
Why? Great. And where's all the UK?
Why are you still shouting?
Money? I'm not. Where's all the UK? Maybe because I don't know. But where's all the UK taxpayers' money?
How many people died?
Been donated to the Palestinians. Why was that not invested in their defensive system? Why was not that invested?
How many people died?
Have you ever made that point?
How many people died?
When?
Last night.
Yesterday.
Yeah. How many Israelis died last night?
One Palestinian.
No. How many Israelis died last night?
In the terrorist attack, there were 6.
No. In the attack by Iran on Israel, how many people died?
None, because...
How dare you say that? I can't believe that you're saying that. Why are you saying that? Why aren't you talking about the Iron Dome? Why are you telling me that no people died in Israel last night? That's outrageous. I'm not upset. I'm not shouting. Why are you telling me that no people died in Israel last night? I can't believe you said none. How dare you say 0? That's so irresponsible. Please stop counting. 10:50 is the time. Iran must pay. Iran will pay. What is the price? What is the price you think they should pay? And for those of us who manage to pursue a slightly more objective perspective, what is the price that you think will be exacted from Iran? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Coming up later on the programme, Natasha Clark will talk us through the leadership speeches in Birmingham during the Conservative Party conference. It's a very, very close to my heart, this, and it may be close to yours. I don't know, but if you ever travel north in this country, certainly through the sort of East Midlands and South Yorkshire, if you take that route, well, how dare I say that? Look at what I just did, Keith. If you ever travel north in this country, it was literally wiped out everything north of Watford as places where you can actually live. Can I stress that I grew up in Kidderminster? I went to school in North Yorkshire. My dad is from Leeds. My mum is from Sheffield. And the way that I just phrased that last contribution is hideous, absolutely hideous. And I often pat myself on the back for not being London-centric. But if you are familiar for whatever reason, because you live, as I used to, in its shadow. When I lived in Burg Wallis near Doncaster, I lived practically within sight of it. But the latter years of my life have seen me encounter it only when I'm travelling north or travelling back south. I'm talking about the power station in Ratcliffe-on-Soar. If you don't know what it's called, you quite possibly would recognise it if you saw it. You know that I'm obsessed with bridges and cranes because I think that they represent man's dominion over nature. That's quite a pompous analysis of why I like bridges and cranes. It may just be that I like bridges and cranes, full stop. But I think it's because of the Brunel type. It turns out there's a Brunel bridge really near me, actually. I'd never known it was Brunel. But anyway, that way in which civilization, industrialization, our ability almost to tame Mother Nature, that is represented by bridges perhaps more than anything else, and by cranes in a more functional way. And that, I think, is why I find the architecture of Ratcliffe-on-Soar, and we're not going to have an environmental debate, I find the architecture of Ratcliffe-on-Soar, I mean, theatrical doesn't come close. It's like a cathedral. It's like the Colosseum. And I'm talking about massive chimneys, for anybody who doesn't know. The massive chimneys that you see from the train at East Midlands Parkway Station, or you see from the motorway as you make your way through the East Midlands and South Yorkshire, are facing demolition. And the most gifted writer of his generation, James Graham, the man most recently responsible for Sherwood on your telly box, he is trying to almost start a campaign for their preservation, and I thought we'd give them a little bit of help at 12:45 today. We're also going to catch up with a former deputy editor of the Sunday Times, now based in New York, on the question of what happened at the vice presidential debate yesterday. As for the rest of the programme, I don't know. Ian says get back to the easy stuff. Ian, there is no easy stuff. It might reach you as hard and easy, but listen, getting a phone in off the ground yesterday about tipping involved different types of mental gymnastics and strength on my part. But, well, all right, yeah, maybe some topics are easier than others. So let's get back to the question of what price Iran will pay and should pay, and whether that is the same price for last night's attack upon Israel. 10:54. And just for the record, there's nothing more objective than counting. Literally. That's why the figure of speech is 2 + 2 = 4. It's supposed to be the one thing over which nobody can ever argue. But turns out you can, eh? Ady's in Amsterdam. Ady, what would you like to say?
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
James. What I would like to do is actually take the temperature down, because all that's been happening over the last 6 months has been very, very, or rather a year, has been very, very emotional. A lot of people angry, a lot of people upset on both sides,
Yes.
which is understandable. But I find it's a really corrosive attitude that's happening and getting a lot of people down and upsetting a lot of people. But coming back to what we said about Iran, I reckon that Israel should actually do nothing. But they will, because this has been a kind of like a long-term project of Netanyahu, even before the attacks on October the 7th, to drag the US and possibly Europe into a larger conflagration in the Middle East against Iran. You know, he's been poking, and then when they take the bait, they attack. And then they will turn around and then speak to America and say to America, look, they attacked us. What are you going to do? And America, of course, because it's an election season, they have to be in this. And then what will happen is you have America and possibly Europe dragged into yet another war.
Another Middle Eastern war.
Like we haven't seen this movie before.
So we just swap Iran. We just swap Iraq for Iran, then.
Yeah, exactly. And then.
Well, do you know, I'd like to poo-poo this.
And say to the world, why do they hate us?
Yeah.
Why do they hate us?
I was going to take a breath then and try and dismantle your position, mindful throughout of your call for calmness. I think that's possibly a little optimistic. But of course, what could happen, I don't even want to say this out loud, is that the response becomes asymmetrical. So there is a terror attack on the West in the style of September the 11th because of people's fury, if you like, about attacks on Lebanon or attacks on Iran or attacks on Gaza, and then that is used. And this is what Joe Biden said, Ady, at the very beginning, when we were possibly all too busy speculating about his mental acuity. He said, don't let this be another 9/11. So the Hamas attack would then somehow provoke an overreaction from, I think he meant Israel in the first instance, but of course another terror attack on Western soil, if it is seen as an act of solidarity with Hezbollah and Iran, would open the door to a sort of George W. Bush II scenario, wouldn't it? That's terrifying.
Yeah,
that's terrifying.
That could be the case. Yeah, that could be the case. But I think is what happened is you've got a lot of frustrated people in the world, of all different backgrounds, and yeah, this is a dangerous thing to have. A very dangerous thing to have. People upset and frustrated, and the thing has to be calmed down. Unfortunately, in terms of the United States, how can the United States ever be an honest broker where they call for calm and then they give weapons to the other side to kill the other people? This is ridiculous. For once, this may sound a bit strange.
Go on.
I wish that China could come and get involved with this.
Why?
Because you know what I mean.
No,
they have no skin. They have no skin in the game.
China's got skin in every game, mate. Every game.
Maybe they could do something about this, yeah. Because to be honest, Iran, Israel, the United States are pox on all their houses. They all have terrible sort of track record in this part of the world. Maybe a different.
And you know,
it's
funny because the impossibility of saying that is the same point you made about the. I mean, some people will furiously reject the idea that there's any sort of moral comparison to be drawn between innocent civilians being killed on October the 7th and innocent civilians being killed in Lebanon in the last week or in Gaza in the last year. Some people will furiously reject that. Some people will see it as almost a sort of conflation or excuse of terrorism. But if you're looking at the reasons why people keep dying, then I don't think it's enormously unreasonable to focus first on the people who are doing the killing, which is what you just did. But but of course, being able to avoid the emotions that you opened with is dependent largely upon how invested you are in the carnage. You know, how close you are to the killing and the dying. I think, and that's why perhaps we don't, in some ways, don't realise how blessed we are, and that's why the fear of a Western response, a Western intervention, which isn't going to happen to symmetrical exchanges of fire between Israel and Iran, but if, you know, Islamist terrorists sympathetic to the Iranian regime were to take action on Western soil, then you do run a risk of history repeating itself, and it's not, sadly, hyperbole or ridiculous to speculate in that direction, because it's exactly what Joe Biden did almost on day one. It's 11 o'clock. It is 4 minutes after 10. So I think we acknowledged, didn't we, with the last caller, there's a luxury of thinking as opposed to feeling. If it was the sky above your head that had been lit up last night with potentially fatal ordnance, then you wouldn't be doing much thinking today. You'd be doing an awful lot of feeling. And it is to that constituency, I think, that Benjamin Netanyahu speaks most obviously. If you had family in Lebanon or Gaza, you wouldn't have been doing much thinking for the last year because you would have been too busy doing the feeling. And the idea that you shouldn't point out the asymmetry of death is, in fact, Sally Ann's just accused me of anti-Semitism for counting, which is a new low, I think. How on earth can it be anti-Semitic simply to count? But the comments there from Peter Lerner, I think that was his name, in the news, they were really interesting in a way, because essentially saying it doesn't matter that we have the Iron Dome, and it doesn't matter that the attacks failed, and it doesn't matter that they weren't targeting civilians. And I struggle to understand that completely, because otherwise, aren't you just saying to Iran, well, if you have another go, target civilians? Our response is going to ignore the fact that the attack failed, civilians weren't being targeted. That's if we maybe play the clip again, Keith, if we can, just to make sure I've heard it correctly. If you're really going to stand up and say the attack failed, civilians weren't targeted, the Iron Dome and other defence systems. I think the Iron Dome is more for the short range than long range, but everything worked brilliantly. One answer to a question that popped up earlier about why people in Gaza don't spend all their money on missile defense systems is that they're not allowed to. But by obviously, Israel controls everything that can get in and out of the area, and the idea that they'd be allowed to build a missile defense system or anything that would keep enemies out, keep people hell-bent on killing them, I thought that was too obvious to explain, but a couple of you are across with me that I didn't, so I have now. That idea that it doesn't matter that it failed, we're going to respond as if it didn't. Is it fair to have a bit of a problem with that? Have a listen to this.
180 ballistic missiles cannot go unanswered, and they were intentional, they were discriminate, and they were dangerous. The fact that our aerial defense systems were able to intercept the vast majority, or that they hit areas which posed no threat to civilians, does not excuse them from the ramifications of their actions.
No, of course there must be ramifications for the actions, but did he mean indiscriminate, or did he mean discriminate when he said that? Because surely the reaction to a discriminate attack would be different to the reaction to an indiscriminate attack. And I do think the reaction to a successful attack would be different from the reaction to an unsuccessful attack. If, for example, Israel had, well, some people have, of course, claimed that they did have intelligence about the imminent attack on October the 7th. But if they had nipped it in the bud, if they almost ambushed the Hamas terrorists that day, and, emerged from their hiding places to kill all the terrorists before they could kill any Israeli civilians, would for the people who think the 40,000 deaths in Gaza subsequently are justified, would they still have been justified if the attack had failed miserably? If the Hamas fighters had descended upon the Nova Music Festival to discover that they were 100% expected, and everybody in the first line of encounter was actually an IDF operative, and the terrorists were exterminated before they could kill any civilians, would the people who still think that the 40,000 and counting death toll in Gaza is justified by the horror of the October the 7th attack, would they still think it was justified if the October the 7th attack had failed? That's why I'm a little bit confused by, A, those comments from Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, speaking to LBC earlier, and B, by our friend in Tel Aviv who's furious about, or not furious, who is, I don't know what word to use now, is concerned about the repetition of the death toll. Because after October the 7th, the death toll was mentioned all the time, quite rightly. So why is it not part of the conversation today when it's currently zero in the context of Israeli civilians? That I don't quite get. I've got to be honest. And listen, I could easily be missing something here, but I don't know at the moment that I am. I really don't. So, of course, it matters, doesn't it? The fact that the attack was, in his words, discriminate. The fact that no civilian targets were reached. I don't know. So, anyway, we're back to the price. What is the price that Iran should pay? And what is the price that Iran will pay? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 9 minutes after 11 is the time. Matt is in Hull, in East Yorkshire. Matt, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello,
I don't know if you remember, but we spoke in April about the attack then, and we've spoken before about my dad's work with NATO and my former work. And
yes, I do remember now. You've reminded me. So it's good to hear your voice again, although you must start ringing me on more cheerful subjects if you can.
Yeah, well, I feel, considering my area of knowledge is supposed to be international relations,
yes.
You can't, unfortunately, be that without having a heavy military knowledge these days. It's such an integrated element. So in April, we spoke about how the Iranians had given 3 days' notice, that the Israelis were able to move equipment away from those target sites, move personnel away, obviously. Last night, the same thing happened, but not 3 days' notice, obviously, a far shorter notice. And from what I'm hearing, up to maybe 20 American F-35 aircraft that the Israeli Air Force was using were destroyed on the same Air Force base in the north that was attacked last time. So, in fact, from Iran's point of view, and from Hezbollah and everybody else, that attack was a success, if that turns out to be correct. It wasn't targeting civilians. It was done at night time, so there would be fewer people just around about in the streets that could be, inadvertently harmed. And so we talked last time about the escalatory ladder.
Yes.
And this is yet again Iran pulling it back a rung. They're saying, look, we've demonstrated back in April that we can breach your defences and at will, pretty much. And that's a maths calculation. So focusing on the number of missiles fired is a bit of a misnomer, because the only way to breach those systems is to overwhelm them with numbers. So the vast majority of what you launch is sacrificial. So you're firing 100 missiles so that 5 get through. So really you're attacking with 5. And if any of the other 95 get through, it's a kind of bonus.
So the possibility of Tehran considering this to be successful has probably been absent from our conversation so far. But that doesn't alter the arithmetic of calculating Israeli response. Israeli response is going to be contingent upon... Well,
yes. So again, last time, if you remember, we...
Well, I don't. Stop saying last time. Do you remember? You're making me feel old. I'm
sorry. we're a similar age, James.
You know how it works. I speak to... you've only phoned me 3 times. I've spoken to considerably more than 3 people in the intervening periods.
Yeah. So we talked about that Israel's response against the Iranian airfield was quite limited, and that was largely done on the basis of a lot of backdoor negotiation between US, UK. Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, he was in both Saudi Arabia and Qatar speaking to Iranian officials. So, a lot of... we have this sort of idea that security services are deep in bunkers under the Kremlin and under London, and, that they're these shadowy figures. They talk to each other constantly. If you want to move some aircraft from one airfield to another in Syria, the Americans have to let other groups know so that they don't interpret that as an attack being launched. So there's this constant communication that we don't really hear about.
It's probably more strained than ever, though, isn't it? I mean, because
undoubtedly,
if the public exhortations for peace have become ever more robust, then the private ones must be off the charts. The Biden's administration must be almost begging Netanyahu to stay his hand, and Netanyahu...
You've got an unfortunate situation in the States now where Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the kind of group that they represent, that usually referred to as the neocons, Reagan began to bring those people into government. They were considered kind of fringe loonies in the time of Reagan, and he began to bring them into government, and they've steadily increased their hold. So people like Victoria Nuland, who've been around for decades, and they really don't care. They really don't care if people are killed, as long as they're not killed inside America.
So what do you think will happen?
What
price America, do you think will be exacted, and how much influence will America have over that? Even?
Well, so Netanyahu's lifeline is to try and draw America in on the ground.
Yes.
Because at the moment, America's only pledging air support. Netanyahu's mistake there is thinking that the United States now is the United States of the 1980s that was, overwhelmingly the world's most powerful military force. I mean, for a lot of reasons, it's no longer that. And they've poured weapons into Ukraine, they've poured weapons into Israel, they've poured weapons into Taiwan and things. So they've depleted their stocks of weaponry. And also back at home in America, the appetite for these wars in the Middle East and abroad is vanishing because, people don't want to send their sons and daughters off to come home maimed and scarred.
And then come November, all bets are off with the American election potentially.
Yeah.
Here's a question that I haven't asked anybody ever. If you're ready for it,
right?
Why aren't UK and American jets shooting Russian missiles out of the sky above Ukraine?
Right. Because again, this all goes back to kind of NATO doctrine. So.
Yeah.
If we directly intervene in that manner, that is World War III, whether we like it or not. That's a direct conflict between NATO forces. And so we've been indirectly in there from day one. We've had SAS in there, we've had SBS in there, we've had commandos in there. We've lost British personnel in Ukraine. But we're not told that because we're not
also
officially...
it's not a formal declaration, and you speak from obviously a position of expertise and experience, but none of that is officially confirmed. It's important to stress that. But if you wanted to have a proper crack at the importance of treaties, which of course certain political figures, largely from the right in this country, but not exclusively from the right, suspicion of NATO is very popular on the left as well. But if you want to understand the importance of treaties, the power of treaties, international treaties, or conventions on things like, for example, human rights, then some of these comparisons are chilling, right? Absolutely chilling. So why can't we shoot Russian missiles out of the sky above Ukraine? But we can help shoot Iranian missiles out of the sky above Israel, missiles that have, thankfully, mercifully, this time, not killed anyone, albeit that the last analysis suggested that there are positive elements if you're in Tehran to draw from this, and yet the missiles being fired from Russia into Ukraine continue to exact incredible tolls, inflict incredible carnage. On the ever-going quest to help you understand how insane my inbox is on days like today, here's Damien. Oh, so Israel let October the 7th happen, did it, James? You are disgusting filth. Mate, all I said was some people think Netanyahu should have done more to stop it, including the leader of the Israeli opposition, who's gone into quite a lot of detail about the Yair Lapid testifying to the Unofficial Citizens Commission of Inquiry, going into quite a lot of detail about the warnings that had been presented to the Prime Minister about the dangers of the policy he was pursuing, about leaving the door open to an attack. It's a very, very widespread element of the story, mate. And if you haven't come across it, that's on you. It doesn't make me filth. It just makes you a bit ignorant. But hey-ho, we're here to help. It is 19 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the words are easy to report and they're easy to understand. Iran will pay a price for last night's attacks upon Israel. The conversation perhaps about whether they were, quotes, successful, end quotes, or not is a little bit more nuanced than we allowed at 10 o'clock this morning, but there it is. The price that must be paid. What is that price? And how much of that price should be informed by the amount of, well, the number of people that Iran managed to kill? If we presume, and please God it isn't, but if we presume that human death is an inevitable consequence of whatever Israel's response is, then how much? I said the question I can't get past this morning, and it only popped into my head 10 minutes ago, is if the October the 7th terror attack had failed, then, or at least if it hadn't killed anybody, if nobody had died, if the terrorists had been eradicated before they were able to enact their murderous plan, would people comfortable with or supportive of the current death toll in Gaza still be comfortable with it? In other words, does the response to an attack that kills nobody merit an identical action to an attack that kills hundreds or thousands? I mean, I'm struggling with that. I don't know if it's symmetrical or not, but it's certainly, as I keep saying, and please, if you're just tuning in, remember, I can't repeat myself constantly, but I acknowledge repeatedly that being able even to think about these things is a luxury not afforded to people who were running for bomb shelters in Israel last night or burying their dead in Gaza and Lebanon today, 21 minutes after 11, and possibly soon in Iran as well. Rob's in St Ives in Cambridgeshire. Rob, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Thanks for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
I'm going to come from a position of, shall we say, Western bliss, where we don't have to face these missiles coming over.
Yes.
But ultimately, I think what I'd like Iran to pay, from my side of things, I think they should just pay for the tarmac that they destroyed, maybe the odd roof tile. Let's be fair, there's reports that they've destroyed aircraft. They're valid military targets. I think that's fair enough. What I think will happen, I think you look at Netanyahu's government, you look at Netanyahu, he does not care about any of the Arab nations. He doesn't care about the welfare of their citizens. He will respond with 2-3 times as many rockets going over and not actually care about they'll be targeted at military targets, and I use the quotation terms, but it doesn't matter who's around them. They'll do it in the middle of a day during a market day. They'll go tenfold.
I mean, you can say that, of course, but I don't know that it's provable or true. I mean,
the provable side of things is going to be the question mark over it. But the experience of what we've seen from Gaza is that they don't care about.
But Iran is a sovereign state, and it is, on the path to being a nuclear power, and it does categorically refuse to recognise Israel's right to exist and seek its eradication. So even in the absence of last night's attacks, you could cite attacks on Iran by Israel as self-defence.
Yeah, I think the difference being is with Iran launching the missiles, I think the Iranian government does, as they have proven, they don't care about their own population, so long as they're following their doctrine to the T.
Yeah.
I think Iran aren't necessarily going to use human shields, but are going to try and play the upper hand to say, look, we only hit military targets, you're hitting us indiscriminately. I ultimately think the objective of the Netanyahu government would be to try and bring America into a land-based war by poking Iran.
Doesn't everyone want that, though?
I don't.
I mean,
so.
In terms of positions of power, I always felt that the response of George W. Bush to the 9/11 terror attacks, going into Afghanistan and going subsequently into Iraq, I kind of felt that was a win for the terrorists because, well, look at what happened subsequently.
They showed that the big beast can be stopped.
Well, not just stopped, but also any claim to the higher ground has been completely abandoned, and the rise of ISIS, all of the subsequent atrocities and horrors visited upon entirely innocent civilians, sort of trace back to that. So Iran doesn't want to go to war with America. Actually, I'm pretty sure of that.
They don't.
No, okay. So they won't respond with their full power, even as Israel prepares to respond with their full power, perhaps.
I mean, at the minute, from news stories I've heard, Iran has got their fighters basically trying to cover their airspace for as much as thing. Israel will not be able to launch any sort of ground invasion of Iran to try and stop any military targets, the same way they've done in Lebanon and the same way they've done in Gaza. So the only option is either launching ballistic missiles or using airstrikes to attack. And we've seen that obviously the air seems to be their preferred option. So we're going to have
how much do we know about Iran, its ability to shoot planes out of the sky, or indeed
they've got
to shoot
F-15s,
missiles?
I believe. They've got F-16s, so they do have relatively modern kit.
But they haven't got an arrow system, and they haven't got David's sling. They haven't got the air defense systems, the missile air defense systems that Israel has.
Not that I'm aware of. No. And to respond to the gentleman from earlier, who you so eloquently convinced from Israel.
Yes.
The reason that the guys like Palestine and Lebanon haven't been putting their money into the air defence systems is because they've been trying to use that hopefully trying to use that for humanitarian purposes.
Well, also, I mean, I'd like to see anyone in Gaza trying to import military equipment with the full agreement of America and Israel. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't necessarily realise that question was worthy of an answer, but I'm grateful to you for providing one. It speaks again of the asymmetry of support, which is the sister of the asymmetry of sympathy, or the symmetry of sympathy. Rob, thank you. 11:26 is the time. Anthony is in Cobham. Anthony, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. Thanks for taking my call. Really interesting. Really interesting. Listen to the debate today. Just sort of really interested. I mean, if you sort of think back to when a lot of this started, really, after the initial terror attacks, when Israel justified, obviously going after Hamas, and their statement was, we're going to completely destroy Hamas, wipe them off the face of the earth, kind of thing.
Well, don't forget, rescuing the hostages was actually the top priority first.
Oh, of course, yes, of course, yes, and sort of obviously as a byproduct of that, defeating Hamas as well. And I sort of remember the news sort of saying, Hezbollah are, a strong ally of Hamas, and they're a very different animal to take on to to Hamas, and it never really seemed to be the intention of Israel to take on Hezbollah to start with. It was all centred around Hamas, and it just sort of seems how quickly the mission creep has happened into Hezbollah.
Don't forget, Hezbollah have been launching. They've been launching missiles into Israel pretty much since the week of the terror attack, in solidarity with Hamas. And we'd also need to know, wouldn't we, when the explosive charges were put in those pages? Because that speaks to the question you're asking.
Now that's obviously been in the making for quite a little bit of time. So the point I'm trying to make is, it looks as if there's sort of a bit of a roadmap to where we are now, and we seem to be at this point. I think that all sort of roads led to here in the end, because Iran has to back their proxies, because the regime in Iran, they rely on this sort of stuff as well to remain in power. It's very popular.
But do you think they would argue? Because of course
they have to do something.
We have to remember that the messages being given to the citizens of Iran might be very different pictures from the ones that we can see, or the messages that we get. So, do you think Iran is hoping that it has done enough to save face and retain relations with its allies, in this case Hezbollah? But not done enough to provoke a Gaza-level response from Israel, in which case I think they've miscalculated.
That's the calibration, isn't it, James? That's the calibration, and now we're going to see the next level of calibration coming from Israel, and I am a little bit concerned about it, because the guy that's got his hand on the trigger there, James, he's fighting for his own political survival as well. Don't forget,
always
to a populist side of his own population now that were obviously, under fire last night to a certain extent. Are they going to be baying for blood?
Do you know?
And if they are baying for blood, I think they may very well be obliged by Netanyahu. That's the thing.
It's a more stable coalition than Israel has ever really seen before. It's the most right-wing coalition ever, but it's also remarkably stable because the far-right figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich don't want any kind of deal with anybody. So that's how Netanyahu gets to resist US pressure, because there's no concomitant pressure being exerted at home. And that, and you're right, to his benefit, kicks the prospect of any elections anytime soon ever further down the road, because they can threaten to pull out. But as long as the fighting continues, and I think if you were Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich or one of their supporters or sympathizers, as long as Israel continues to kill Arabs, Netanyahu's position is safe. That's a brutal distillation, and I hope it's wrong, but that's how it looks to me, and that's what we do. That's what Anthony just did. That's what I do every day. I give you my honest opinions about things, with a constant caveat that I could be wrong. Here's Thomas Watts with your headlines. 33 minutes after 11. I mean, crikey, it's an observation I don't think I've ever made before, but you've got 1,400 years of often bloody schism within the religion of Islam between Sunni and Shia. But when it comes to killing Israelis, suddenly they're on the same team again, looking at the way in which Hezbollah's attacks upon Israel have been done in solidarity with Hamas in Gaza. And you think every time you think you've just about scaled the peaks of complexity and complication, you remember there's another mountain over there that you've not even started to climb yet. We're looking at the question of what the price will be, what the price could be, what the price should be that Benjamin Netanyahu will exact from Iran in response to last night's largely, if not entirely, unsuccessful attacks upon Israel. And well, I think the only thing we can all agree on is that it's not going to be pretty. 11:34 is the time. And if you're wondering about what might change in the event of Donald Trump getting back into the White House, here's a little reminder of what his running mate's relationship with simple observable facts actually is. Because I keep talking about how counting is the only truly objective thing out there. But I guess that's only true until it isn't.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
So J.D. Vance still refusing to answer the very simple question about whether or not his running mate in the American election actually lost the election in 2020. Spoiler alert, he did. Balama is in Lambeth, often a helpful guide to some of these complicated matters, not least because it's an area of academic expertise for Balama. So what made you pick up the phone today?
No, thank you, James, for taking the call. Let me just start by saying if your accounting is anti-Semite, it was President Biden that first said the attack was ineffective and defeated. Yes, and so he's the first anti-Semite, I think, if just counting is anti-Semitic.
Well, that was only Sally Ann, to be fair. I don't think anybody else levelled that accusation at me, but if she is still listening, then hopefully she'll take that on board. But I'm not overly optimistic. Anyway, back to your reason for calling.
Yeah, so James, we are talking about what price Iran should pay, because paying a price was the language Netanyahu used. And Peter Lerner's clip that you played earlier talked about the attack not going unanswered. And that is not self-defense in law, James. That's retaliation, that's revenge. When you talk about paying price, you are talking about punishment.
Yes.
In law, self-defense is only warranted where there is an attack that you are seeking to prevent, or that you are seeking to repel, or there is an imminent threat of attack that you are seeking to prevent.
Right.
Now, and I think Keir Starmer in particular knows that very well. David Lammy knows it. Maybe President Biden, given his performance at the debate, may not remember. Yes. But they know very well that what Israel is saying is not self-defense. Self-defense cannot be exerted in international law in this situation. They are saying self-defense because they want to justify continuing to support Israel and to continue to give it.
If it's exclusively confined to military facilities, doesn't that fall under preventing future attacks? I mean, Iran have essentially established that their willingness and desire, and I grant you they didn't do this last night, they did this earlier this year, their willingness and capability to not only attack Israel, but to breach Israel's defences. So removing Iran's ability to attack them again, could that be filed under self-defense?
Yeah, I mean, you can define that under preemptive self-defense, but that requires very strict conditions. For preemptive self-defense to apply, the threat must be instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means or no moment for deliberation. This principle I have just outlined was in fact deliberated in a case, in a conflict between the United States and Britain during the colonial period around 1837. That it has to be instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means or no moment for deliberation. And I think these conditions don't apply in this situation. And if Israel is allowed to apply that, this preemptive self-defense principle to attack Iran, Iran could very well say, look, they are attacking Lebanon, they are attacking Yemen after Gaza, and so they may be attacking us, and that's why we are preemptively attacking them.
Yes.
But if you looked at Section 51 of the UN Charter, it provides that preemptive self-defense can only be used after the United Nations Security Council has approved it.
Right.
So if that's what Israel wants to do, it should submit its application, its motion to the United Nations Security Council that it is going to launch a preemptive self-defense. I think
has it done that before? Has Israel ever done that before?
No, not to my knowledge, because they will say that the United Nations itself is anti-Semite. And when we talk about what they may likely do,
yes.
Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, has indicated that, he was advising Netanyahu, and I think it is an advice Netanyahu may well take, that they should target Iranians' nuclear weapon and program and their central energy facilities.
Mm.
And of course, Naftali Bennett sees this as the greatest opportunity in 50 years to change the face of the Middle East. And unfortunately, I think that's what Netanyahu also sees this as.
Why unfortunately? Just in your own words.
It's unfortunate because it will lead to more escalation. Because if you attack Iran, Israel is incapable of doing what it did in Gaza in Iran, because yes. Iran has weapons the Palestinian or Hamas doesn't have, but it also has allies like Russia.
Yes.
I am sure Russia is looking for an opportunity to retaliate against the West, what they did to it in Ukraine,
right.
And it is going to help Iran. And so it will be a cycle of, escalation after escalation. We talk about Netanyahu.
It's this human condition that leads people in positions of power to think that they can contain these forces. And you could go back thousands of years and find a leader thinking, if I do this, then that will happen, and none of the other stuff will. It's like you can throw a rock into a lake and not create any ripples. That's what I hear as you speak, Bulama.
There is that, James, but there is something in addition to that. When I saw Netanyahu's speaking a few weeks ago, yes, what I saw is a radicalized old man. And I tell you this as someone whose job is de-radicalizing ISIS fighters.
Yes.
That's my day job right now as I speak.
Gosh.
And what I saw is someone who is radicalized, and we know Iranian leaders are also radicalized. And so you have two radical extremists, if
yes,
you like, who are fighting, and both of them are fighting knowing that they are safe. They know that the missiles they are going to use are only going to kill civilians, and so their lives are safe, and therefore they think they can venture into anything. And I think the only person that can help this situation is America and European leaders, and they are not doing that right now. I think Keir Starmer and President Biden should do better. They should stop sending weapons, and they should stop paying lip service. This is a political crisis. The only way you can start de-radicalizing the Middle East is to address the underlying causes of this crisis in the first place. Two safe and secure states, sovereign states of Israel and Palestine, and then you can start to talk about educating the population and about de-radicalizing the radical ideology on both sides.
So you put the cart before the horse, really, don't you? And I think I've never heard it put so persuasively, actually. But and I know, you know better than I do, that the people with the fingers on the buttons are the people most diametrically opposed to any prospect of a two-state solution on all sides of this conflict.
Yes, and the West that says we want a two-state solution, and I think if the West is in alignment with the United Nations, they can impose a two-state solution that may be opposed in the beginning, but then when they see it as a reality, the parties would accept it. I think that would be the way to go. But then what we see in the West, unfortunately, is not helping matters.
No, it clearly isn't. And to that point, Bulama, you began by referencing the United Nations. I don't know if you were aware that Israel's foreign minister has said in the last few minutes that he is barring the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres from even entering the country over his failure to unequivocally condemn Iran's massive missile attack on Israel. So the likelihood of the United Nations being able to exercise much leverage upon the Israeli government looks slim to vanishing, if indeed it was a real prospect even before.
No, I completely agree. Unless the United States, because when Netanyahu talks about their capabilities, he knows that he is zero without the United States. And if the United States could step up, maybe we will see some sense in Netanyahu, and maybe things will start to get better.
Because otherwise we're in this constant surreal cycle of Joe Biden saying, stop dropping bombs, stop dropping bombs, stop dropping bombs, here's some bombs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, it really is. I'm not oversimplifying it. That is what is happening. That's what's been happening for the best part of a year.
Exactly. And then what do you see? Of course, if you say the United Nations did not unequivocally condemn the attack by Iran, then you talk about how many Western leaders have condemned the invasion of Lebanon. How many Western leaders condemned the violation of Iranian sovereignty when Israel attacked Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas in Iran. I think we have to have some semblance of being
symmetry,
unbiased,
yes,
some neutrality, some sense of looking at both sides before we can start to solve this crisis. But
yes,
this escalation of military or weapons after weapons is not going to help anyone. Unfortunately, it is civilians, especially women and children, that will continue to die. And now our attention has been shifted from Gaza. We are now starting to count the casualties in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And who knows, tomorrow might be Yemen or it might be
and actually,
Iran.
I don't. The people are upset or unhappy about the context of counting casualties in Israel. I wonder how many people died in Gaza yesterday, who we haven't even mentioned at all after 1 hour and 45 minutes of conversation.
Exactly. And if you looked at international law, James, the Iron Dome is doing its job. Because one other condition of self-defense in international law is that you can only use force where there is no any other alternative.
Yes, and the Iron Dome. Yeah, okay. I guess that's it then, isn't it? Really, until America. That's the only thing Netanyahu fears is a loss or diminishment of American sponsorship, and the rhetoric doesn't touch the sides. It's only the actions that will matter, and they don't. The rhetoric,
and when America says it's enough, we have had enough of killing of civilians. We want to now step up to global leadership in the universal human rights that we claim. Then perhaps we will see things starting to change. Otherwise, we would continue to see escalation, and the only victim would be civilians who have no stake in this crisis and who cannot rein any of the parties in.
And to that end, Israel's military carried out a series of strikes in Gaza yesterday that killed at least 21 people, according to local officials. And yet, for reasons that Balama probably understands better than I do, we've had a conversation today about no people being killed in Israel. And that's what the world is talking about. That's what all the headlines are dominated by. And yet Israel's military killed at least 21 people in Gaza yesterday alone, including an attack on a school that was sheltering displaced people in Gaza City. So if you don't understand anger or confusion, you'd have to be able to unravel that particular riddle. Balama, thank you. It's always a great privilege to actually talk to you. And I wasn't aware of the work that you're currently doing in the field of de-radicalisation. That's something I'd like to talk to you more about in the future, either on air or off air, according to your choice. Speaking about people who are confused and angry, you heard me say a few moments ago to Balama that one of the problems is, of course, that all of the people with their fingers on the metaphorical and literal buttons are opposed to the two-state solution, by which I meant, most obviously, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Benjamin Netanyahu's government. They don't want a two-state solution. But Avi heard it differently. He's texted to say, no, James, the Iranians don't want a two-state solution. You know that. You're just being disingenuous now. And literally, who do you think I meant? In the context of a conversation about people who fired bombs yesterday, you think I was somehow not referring to the people who fired missiles yesterday. That's what happens when your head is just boiled. When your blinkers are not even just stuck to your head, they're welded to it. Like when you see a bicycle in a tree. There's a line you weren't expecting to come out in the context of this conversation. Have you ever seen that, Keith? Have you ever seen what happens if you lean your bicycle against a tree in, say, 1984, and then you come back to it 20 or 30 years later, and the bicycle is now part of the tree? That's how wrong you are, Avi. Your wrongness is now part of you. Your determination to hear things that have not been said is like a bicycle stuck in the middle of a tree. Obviously, I talk about the powers that are opposed to a two-state solution. I'm referring to the country that I described half an hour ago as being dedicated to the eradication of Israel. I'm talking about the country that refuses to even recognize the modern state of Israel. I'm talking about Iran. But in your head, with your bicycle wedged to your trunk, you think that I'm leaving Iran out of the conversation. But my job is to keep plugging away. It is 11:51. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention away from the immediate events of last night, although, of course, the looming American election does have quite a strong bearing upon the situation in the Middle East. We won't know what that bearing is until the election is complete. And it was the turn of the VIPs, the vice presidents, yesterday to have one of these bizarre debates in which the difficulty really of facts versus alternative facts has never been more clearly highlighted, perhaps, than when J.D. Vance. Well, listen to it yourself.
In Springfield, Ohio, and in communities all across this country, you've got schools that are overwhelmed. You've got hospitals that are overwhelmed. You have got housing that is totally unaffordable because we brought in millions of illegal immigrants to compete with Americans for scarce homes.
Just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but Margaret, the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check. And since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. The CBP One app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something that Kamala Harris created, Margaret.
Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut.
Hey, you said we weren't going to have fact checking. God. And I used to find that, well, I still somehow find elements of it funny, but the idea that that will have any impact whatsoever upon support for the Donald Trump, J.D. Vance campaign, I'm afraid that idea left the building probably around the time Kellyanne Conway coined the phrase alternative facts to describe blatant lies, up to and including ultimately, although she wouldn't have known this at the time, lies about the 2020 election result, which J.D. Vance refused to refute again last night. So we turn now to Sarah Baxter, who's the director of the Marie Colvin Center in New York. Marie, one of the finest foreign correspondents ever to put pen to paper. She's also a columnist for The Standard and has just written a piece for them about the vice presidential debate. It's a tough one, this, Sarah, because given that the normal rules of engagement disappeared over the horizon some time ago, probably best evinced by the citing of alternative facts as a real thing, what do we actually look for now in a debate between these two characters, between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance? What does success look like?
Success means getting the better of your opponent, whether or not you're using the right facts. I mean, Tim Walz has himself exaggerated a few details on occasion, nothing as egregious as J.D. Vance. But the truth is, Mr. Nice Guy from Minnesota, the guy with the vibes, the big dad energy, Tim Walz, he flubbed it. He normalized the guy that he once portrayed as weird, J.D. Vance. I couldn't believe it. That was not an outcome I was expecting. I thought J.D. Vance would be a smooth debater. I didn't expect Tim Walz to basically say, you and I are the nice guys in this. We could get along so well doing that kind of folksy thing about bipartisanship. And J.D. Vance, frankly, couldn't believe his luck.
And this is, I think, is reflected in some of the betting markets immediately after the debate, in that Trump's campaign has come out of it stronger than Harris's. Is that, I mean, is that an example of Tim Walz being punished for his attempts to be equable? I mean, it's an environment that doesn't welcome that kind of approach, and he has underestimated the role that vituperation's going to play.
I think he had this idea. This must have been part of the Tim Walz game plan, because it was such a pattern, and I can't quite believe he was encouraged in this. But to sort of make him and J.D. Vance look okay and Donald Trump somehow weird, but he never really got on to critiquing Donald Trump effectively, and ended up on the back foot himself several times in the night over various issues. So including whether or not he was in Hong Kong at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was in 1989 and took place in Beijing. So it was a funny thing to be caught out on.
Yes.
But this was a kind of surreal moment. But the truth is, he let J.D. Vance get away with the they're eating the cats and dogs thing. He never once got under J.D. Vance's skin. By the end of the night, J.D. Vance is sort of relaxed, supremely confident, calling Governor Walz Tim as if they were all best friends. And it made viewers think, hey, maybe this
guy's not that weird.
This guy's not that weird. And maybe with him on the ticket, you know what, we might be okay under Donald Trump. Now, that surely was not the message that the Harris campaign...
Because really what they wanted to do was float the idea that if Trump were to perish in office, this guy will be in charge, and even if you quite like Trump, that's a risk you can't afford to run. And they've kind of shot that fox by under your analysis.
Yeah, they absolutely did. What Tim Walz should have done was said, look, this inexperienced guy, J.D. Vance, who, by the way, is 20 years younger than Tim Walz and less seasoned a politician, still got the better of him. This guy, J.D. Vance, is meaner, more misogynistic and horrible than Donald Trump. He's the epitome of the new weird in the Republican Party. And this is not what happened at all. This was almost like, well, if only Donald Trump could go, we could all get back to our nice business as usual consensus on Capitol Hill. You know, Walz, an ex-congressman for many years. So no newbie at this game, despite pretending he was.
But maybe not used to knife fights. I mean, he might be a seasoned politician, but this is a battlefield upon which very few people have cut their teeth. Yeah,
fair point. And J.D. Vance, with his hillbilly origins, went to Yale Law School and is a pretty polished debater.
Yes.
I mean, one thing, the media is always very upset with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz that they don't give enough interviews. And it did look like Walz was out of practice. There have been complaints that he's been kept in a bubble by the Harris campaign along with her, so he doesn't make any gaffes. So he comes out on the biggest night and makes a gaffe. He did, however, nail Vance on one thing which you highlighted, which is the servile attitude that J.D. Vance has towards Donald Trump, which means that he couldn't admit that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. Vance was nailed on that one, and it may be the big quote takeaway of the night.
Yeah, and then we're moving into the realm of that dreadful word optics. Finally, it was all to play for before, and it's still all to play for now. That's the kind of full stop on the events of last night.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been great for the Democrats to get a bounce out of the night. In fact, a snap poll showed, maybe Vance winning on 42% and Walz on 41%. And then, of course, all the Democrats say, well, vice presidential debates don't matter anyway. And maybe they don't. But Harris could do with another burst of momentum. There's only a month to go.
Indeed, there is. I said that was my final question. I've got one more, but you don't have to answer it. What on earth is an undecided in the context of a battle like this one?
Well, I can tell you that CNN
yes.
got their own undecided panel of 6 people who were so gormless that by the end of the night, 5 of them were still undecided. And one of them, encouragingly for the Democrats, said, well, I'm going to vote Harris because of that comment about from Vance about the 2020 election.
About the election. Yeah, you're right. That has been picked up quite widely, although it's hard to imagine that seeing Trump lose a single established voter, someone already intending to vote for him, as a consequence of that being highlighted. Sarah Baxter, thank you, Director for the Marie Colvin Centre in New York and the former Deputy Editor of the Sunday Times. I'm told that Robert Jenrick has just slagged me off on stage at the Conservative Party conference. So if there was any reluctance to turn our attention to the Conservative Party conference next, Robert Jenrick has just very, very successfully attracted my attention. I wonder if it makes the news bulletin. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've got quite a lot to get through in the second half of the programme. The schedule was that Natasha would join us at 12:35 to have a little look at the speeches given by the 4 Tory leadership candidates while we've been on air. We're going to jump that gun a little bit because one of them has just revealed live on the conference stage that I live rent-free in his head. So you'll forgive me for wanting to draw a little bit of your attention to that. And then I'm very keen to find out more about James Graham's campaign, the playwright and screenwriter. Very, very nascent campaign, and by which I mean really there isn't a campaign. All he's done is essentially sort of say, wouldn't it be good if we could keep these iconic cooling towers and the sort of borders of the East Midlands and South Yorkshire? And I completely agree. I think they're incredibly beautiful structures at Ratcliffe-on-Soar. As the power station shuts down, the cooling towers ideally would remain as a testament to man's dominion over nature, or indeed as the sort of dark satanic mills of the 20th century, as opposed to the century that William Blake was writing about when he coined that phrase. But look, can I confide in you quickly, briefly? Sometimes when I'm doing the work of the angels, I wonder whether whatever the opposite of the angels is, I wonder whether it works, whether it lands. When I remind you, for example, of the time that Honest Bob Jenrick, well, I even wonder whether the nickname Honest Bob Jenrick is something that gets under his skin or whether it bothers him. Or, why do we call him Honest Bob Jenrick? Well, not least because of his role in saving the pornographer Richard Desmond £45 million in levies after deliberately helping a Tory donor to avoid paying a new tax on his housing development. Or when I talk about the decision to paint over the murals of cartoon characters. This isn't funny, actually. I'm tickled pink by what I'm about to play to you, but there's nothing funny about looking at a processing centre for unaccompanied child asylum seekers and thinking, let's make it even less welcoming. What can we do? Here's some desperate children. God knows what they've seen. God knows what they've witnessed. And look, there's a cartoon on the wall in the otherwise bleak building where their application for a new life will be processed. There's a cartoon on the wall, and Honest Bob Jenrick turns up and says, "Can we paint over that, please?" So, actually, when I hope that my condemnation of incomprehensible callousness like that goes out live on the radio, I hope it reaches their ears. I hope it gets to them. I really do. But you never know for sure whether it actually does or not.
The country needs a leader. Instead, with Starmer, we've got an undertaker. And what about the cabinet? What about our new cabinet? Well, Rachel Reeves, as wooden as Pinocchio, and only barely more honest. And then we've got Ed Miliband. Whoever tells you the grown-ups are back in charge, look at Ed Miliband. A Wallace missing his grommet. And then, there's David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary. Living proof that there is a more annoying LBC presenter than James O'Brien.
I love that. Why does he pause for special effect when he's talking about the black man? And then there's David. What is it about David that means he gets a sort of separate or a specific little nudge that he believes his audience at the Conservative Party conference will respond to? How many people in that room do you think know who I am? You see, that sounds like an arrogant, that sounds like a conceited. I'd be surprised if 20%. I mean, really? Am I that big a deal? Am I that big a deal for the potential next leader of the Conservative Party that he A, thinks everyone in the room is going to know who I am, and B, believes that they'll be aware of the job that I do in reminding you of some of his greatest hits, like the time that he helped a Tory donor avoid paying £45 million in levies, an act that was subsequently roundly condemned, and of course that infamous occasion when he ordered that cartoons. So imagine your child now. Let's have a little word about Honest Bob Jenrick. This is me being annoying, much more annoying than David Lammy can ever be. So just imagine, I want you to think of a child that you love, okay? This is what I want you to do. Grandchild, child, nephew, niece, sibling. Just think of a child. Let's say an 8-year-old child that you love, that you care for. Okay? Now hold that picture in your mind. Hold that child's face in your mind right now. Okay? You got one? I have. Got a godson, actually. My kids are a little bit older now. So there's my godson right there. Now imagine the worst. Now imagine that he was lost, or that she was alone for whatever reason, the war at home, or the environmental disaster, the catastrophe that had killed their parents, or seen their parents calculate that their best chance of survival and safety would be to be entrusted into the hands of comparative strangers who had promised to get them to a country where you had family. A country where you are, okay? So it's you now. You've got two faces in your head. You've got the face of an 8-year-old child that you love, and you've got your own face now, because that 8-year-old child has somehow managed to get into one of those infernal dinghies in which people routinely risk their lives to cross the English Channel, because that 8-year-old child's only chance of safety is coming to you. Now imagine for a moment how traumatized that child is. Imagine what it would be like not to know where mum and dad are, or even to know that they're dead, not to have seen your siblings since you set off on this infernal journey. Just imagine for a moment what that child would feel like in that boat, in that dinghy, at the mercy of murderous people traffickers. Imagine just for a second how that child feels, and how terrified they are, even if the journey is successful, even if they reach the United Kingdom where you are waiting for them, the uncle, the aunt, the brother, the sister, the grandparent. You're waiting for them here. This is all that they've dreamt of in all the time that they have risked their life to make that journey. And they get here. And they're rounded up by authorities. I mean, it feels like they are under arrest. Goodness knows what experiences they've had in their countries of origin, but there will be echoes of those oppressions, those abuses, in the way that you are rounded up and singled out and processed. And then you get, if you understand, if they found a translator, if you can't speak English, this 8-year-old child that you love, if English doesn't work for you, imagine a language you can't speak. That's the language they're hearing. And they get to the building where the paperwork is done. They haven't heard a word of comfort for a week, a month, 6 months. They haven't had a cuddle for God knows how long. And they get into the building where their application to join you in a place of safety is set to be processed. That's what happens to that child. And Robert Jenrick walked into that building one day where the 8-year-old child you love is hopefully being helped into the bosom of your family. Robert Jenrick walked into that building full of children who've been through the privations and the abuses that we can barely imagine. Robert Jenrick walked into that building, saw some pictures on a wall, and thought that the building was too welcoming. He thought that the welcome for that child was too warm. That's honest Bob Jenrick. That child, after that journey, with that history, walks into that building, and Robert Jenrick felt, as a father, Robert Jenrick felt that the welcome was too warm. The building was too pleasant. The atmosphere was too kind and too gentle. So he ordered that the pictures of cartoon characters be painted over. That's the man that wants to lead the Conservative Party. That's the man that members of the Conservative Party, if he receives the support of his parliamentary colleagues, which is not certain but likely, that's the man you get the chance to vote for. So when you do come to cast your vote, think about the 8-year-old child and think about the welcome you'd like them to receive in the event of them being tossed upon the oceans or bombarded by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. That's all. Obviously, for business reasons, I kind of hope he gets in. Him or Badenoch would be the best for business, but, as has been the case since 2016, what's good for business is very bad for the soul and bad, obviously, for the United Kingdom. How annoying was that? 12:16 is the time. Back to the rather more important question of what the price that Benjamin Netanyahu will exact from Iran for last night's missile attacks will be. What that price will be, what it should be, and, of course, what it could be. Anthony is in Bletchley Park. Anthony, what do you reckon?
James, good afternoon. I'm very glad I followed your monologue on Jenrick rather than your last learned caller on the Middle East crisis. To answer your question precisely, I think the price that Israel will exact is one that Iran is actually able to pay.
Go on.
Israel's going to want to send a message, but it's going to have to be measured. If you think back to the last Israeli response to the missile and drone attacks on Israel, it was very limited and precise, and very importantly, it deliberately highlighted the Israeli targeting capability. So they said, look, this is what we can do. So the next attack might be bigger, but it's still going to be calculated very carefully by those prioritising what's called the options on the JTL, which is the Joint Targeting List.
Yeah.
And clearly options are going to be military, nuclear infrastructure, the oil sector, and also key personnel. I noted in the Iranian press this morning that they said the Supreme Leader is going to be leading Friday prayers in Tehran on Friday. And I imagine that hasn't escaped the views of the Joint Targeting List people as well. But, of course, behind all this, there is the...
Hasn't it changed, though? Haven't we learnt since then, since that last... the world, we've learnt since the last response that... Because I think Netanyahu's hand could be stayed by Joe Biden back then. I'm not sure it can now. I think that there is a shift in relations that means that the response this time might go much further than the last one.
It is possible, and also, those who never learn from the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. Is a much used truism, but very relevant to the Middle East. But speaking to your comment on the risk of escalation, the US is going to be working like 10 men to ensure that any attack doesn't cause even a greater escalation, which, of course, from an American perspective, could risk the lives of their personnel. They've still got the guts of 2,500 people in Iraq.
So surgical strikes on proven potential threats.
That is, I think, a credible response from Israel.
And it would be hard to object to that.
Exactly, and also that speaks to my point about it's got to be a price that Iran is able to pay, and also that it can almost able to justify to its people.
But it would be the first time arguably since October the 7th, but certainly since the beginning of this year, that Benjamin Netanyahu had acknowledged the caution being urged upon him by his allies. Or the second time, actually, and the first time would be the Iran example, wouldn't it?
There's a first time for everything. And the other thing I would caution on this, and this is not cautioning you, it's just a caution perhaps to the armchair strategists, is that the attack on Israel, I've read a huge amount of material on it, of the latest attack. I mean, yes, they used 180 ballistic missiles, but at the end of the day, that's a fraction of what Iran actually could unleash if they wanted to.
Is it?
Yes, they've got thousands of missiles.
Okay.
I mean, Hezbollah had 150,000 missiles and drones.
Yes.
And that's what they've exported from Iran to Lebanese.
So it's brinksmanship then, what you're describing. I mean, Israel's not going to unleash its full capabilities on Iran or Lebanon or Gaza, and
no, I don't think so.
and Hezbollah, and more pertinently this afternoon now, Iran is not going to go all in on its capabilities as well. And
I think not. The other thing is, if I can just speak to the severity of the attack, I watched a lot of video on it and some live streaming from colleagues in Tel Aviv, and the one thing that struck me was that, missiles did get through. And again, it was a coordinated air defence package. Both the UK, the US and Jordan were all involved, as well as the Israeli Iron Dome system and two other air defence systems that they use. But at the end of the day, the missiles that Iran said they fired was the Fatah 1 ballistic missile. Now, to give some context, that carries between 350 and 450 kilo payload. So that's like a large-sized car. So the damage that actually took place was incredibly minimal, because if we only lost one poor Palestinian, who, by the way, was a refugee from Gaza, the guy who got killed, it seems to me that the Iranian message was actually more important than the payload and the damage it caused. It was saying, this is what we can do. And before you dive in on me...
I'm not diving in, I promise. I'll let you finish that.
Thank you. If I could just refer to the court to a tweet in Elon Musk's online sewer from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbot. He posted a tweet after the attack that said, and I'm quoting here, "Our action is concluded unless the Israeli regime decides to invite further retaliation. In that scenario, our response will be stronger and more powerful."
Okay.
But the key bit from that is that to me says that Tehran is sending a message. Our action is concluded. Now, of course, if Israel chooses to respond, then Iran has said, well, we told you so, we'll fire back.
Okay.
But actually, I feel that they are still trying to draw a line under this, and they are trying to make the point that they do not want a major escalation because it serves nobody's interests. It doesn't serve Israel's interest. It certainly doesn't serve Iran's interest.
It doesn't serve Israel's interest, but it might serve Benjamin Netanyahu's.
Yes, but I think one needs to separate political self-preservation from Israeli national defence. I know the two are interlinked in the sense that he's the prime minister, but at the end of the day, an awful lot of Israelis do not support what he does. So we are seeing a dichotomy where...
Although they're more likely to support action on that border than they are on the border with Gaza now. I think taking out Hezbollah in this way has landed very differently from the continuing killing of civilians in pursuit of Hamas terrorists.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it would be naive for anybody not to assume that an Israeli who is able to return to their house after being forced to leave them after continuous attacks from Lebanese Hezbollah missiles is not going to turn around and say, "I'm very glad I can go home." That would just be, a blatant act of, total lack of common sense.
And so the question of whether or not the quotes failure end quotes of the and I think those are Joe Biden's quotes, as an earlier caller reminded us, of the Iranian attack. That's all on Israel now. Then this question, those quite bellicose words from the Lieutenant Colonel that we played out about an hour ago, about it doesn't matter that it failed, it doesn't matter that it didn't work. That might prove to be more like rhetoric rather than a mission statement.
When you've ever heard an Israeli military spokesman being anything other than bellicose?
Yeah, well, that's why they've got the jobs in the first place, I think. Thank you, Anthony. From one Anthony to another, honestly, they're like bloody buses. This one is the Chair of War Studies at the University of Exeter, Anthony King, Professor Anthony King, no less. What would escalation look like now?
Well, I mean, the previous caller I thought was very interesting, and I'd agree with much of what they said. I mean, I think escalation, and obviously President Biden is keen to avoid this. I think it would be an Israeli airstrike and a rocket strike on Iran, as the previous callers and other people this morning have already said. I mean, I think that's the obvious response, a response against Iranian military targets in Iran, and perhaps on some critical national infrastructure that supports those military capabilities. I mean, that's also been articulated in the press, and I think not implausible. I think the Israelis are more likely to do a more military strike, and that's what everyone's worried about. I mean, it's not totally obvious, even with the Netanyahu government. It's not totally obvious that they would go for that, and not least because it's pretty clear. I mean, one of the reasons the Americans provided additional Iron Dome air defense, it seems to me, is because they're desperately keen not for this to turn into an Israeli-Iranian war, an exchange of missiles and rockets and air delivered bombs across each border. So I think escalation is dangerously likely, i.e. a retaliation to which Iran must retaliate. And that's the dynamic that everyone's worried about. Of course, I take this statement slightly differently. I actually think, just like in April with a mass drone strike, Iran has said, this is what we're doing, we don't want a retaliation. I think they're actually aware of the military differential between their capabilities and the Israelis. And the Israelis, whatever we think of the politics, the legality of the operations in Gaza, Hezbollah, etc., especially against Hezbollah, they have been extraordinarily military effective. And, Iran has got to take some, that has got to be scary for the Iranian regime and the Iranian military.
What do we know about Iran's military? Well, sorry, what do you know about Iran's military capabilities?
Well, it's a highly capable military, and led, of course, by the IRGC, the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, which is a very interesting organisation in that it has conventional military capabilities, but a kind of special forces capability, a cyber capability, and those kind of additional 21st century capabilities. And they've been extremely effective in the last 20 years, engaging in Iran, in Iraq during the war when the US were there, and of course, absolutely central to the Syrian civil war, supporting assets. They're a highly capable force, but what has been interesting to see over the last 12 months is the fact is the Israeli Defense Force has proved itself more than a match for Hezbollah and for the IRGC as opponents. So they're very capable, the Iranians. And of course, this is why the Americans are so worried, because they are very capable and have a suite of capabilities across which can affect the Red Sea right through to the Gulf and up to Syria and into Lebanon. So their sweep is wide and across domains as well. But it's less than Israel has proved at this point, and that's where the decision lies.
So, what are we looking for next, and when?
I suspect Israel will respond. I suspect they will, and I suspect there will be precision attacks on key military nodes in Iran that facilitated these rocket strikes. That would be my anticipation. It's possible that the Biden administration will be able to restrain them. It's possible. That would be my prediction. And in Lebanon, I would predict that would be concurrent with increased activity south of the Litani River and the continuing elimination of Hezbollah nodes across the country. So definitely an intensification up north, possibly with the support of attacks on Iran. I hope not. I hope they'll be constrained, but I think it's in that likely camp rather than now improbable or unlikely.
And any comment on the refusal to allow the Secretary General of the United Nations to set foot in Israel, according to the Israeli Foreign Minister?
I mean, totally predictable. Right. I mean, the fact is, whether we agree with it or not, the Israelis are utterly furious and totally dismissive of the UN. Obviously, there's been those accusations, some of which are evidence of collusion between UN, UNRWA and Hamas. The UN has been incapable of enforcing Resolution 1701, South of the Litani River, since 2006. So, I mean, frankly, the Israelis, the UN has become an irrelevance for them. Interestingly, a typical position of a state when it thinks it's fighting for its own survival, that the UN it's a really important organisation. But when we move to this scale of conflict, it becomes a secondary issue for those states involved.
Very powerfully put, as always, Professor Anthony King, Professor of War Studies Chair of War Studies at the University of Exeter. And I hope the other Anthony was still listening to the Professor's warm words about his analysis of this current situation that immediately preceded his, because I have said it again, I have said it before, and I will say it again. If things go right on a day like today, you can tell I find the territory unbearable. I find these conversations so harrowing and difficult. I really envy people who do what I do for a living, who just don't care about anything. It must be so liberating to come on air and sort of think, oh, well, I'm a bit more pro this than that, or I'm on this side, or I do that and the other. It must be lovely not to actually take this stuff home with you. But when it goes right, goodness me, the quality of contributions that we get on this programme is what keeps me going. So thank you for that. That, of course, and the thought that I'm living rent-free in honest Bob Jenrick's head. Here's Amelia Cox with your headlines. It is 12:34. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are probably beginning to draw a temporary line under the events above and in Israel last night and turn our attention to matters rather closer to home. Natasha Clark has had the considerable pleasure of attending the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham in its entirety, and it has culminated, if that's the right word to use, in the last hour or so with speeches from the four leadership contenders. Which I haven't got written down in front of me, but I will now do my level best to remember. Honest Bob Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch, Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly.
Well done.
Thank you very much.
You get a prize for that one.
So what can you tell us?
So it's the final day of the Conservative Party conference here in Birmingham, and it is their, of course, final chance for those four leadership rivals to address the party members. And after 4 days of hobnobbing, schmoozing, drinking canapes, no sleep, and having to smile and talk to people you'd rather not, the four candidates have taken to the stage to give their final pitches. Here is what the four candidates, Tom Tugendhat, James Cleverly, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, had to say.
Please welcome Tom Tugendhat.
Friends, we need to remember who we serve and how our problems are connected and how we fix them together. We need to give young people the chance to own a home, connect that home to work and that work to growth. That's our route back. That's how we win again.
James Cleverly.
Let's rebuild this party of ours with one purpose: to turn the page on this useless Labour government, to get to government, to look to the future with one voice. and say that it is morning once again in this great country of ours.
Robert Jenrick.
A Conservative opposition facing a big choice: to go along with a failed consensus that is driving our country into the ground, or to have the courage, to summon the courage to change course. Join me, work with me in this new Conservative Party.
Kemi Badenoch.
For too long, politicians have been scared of the truth. For too long, politicians have hidden behind spin. For too long, politicians have told the public what they wanted to hear and then done their own thing. Well, I say enough.
James, just a flavour of what the 4 leadership candidates had to say in the last few minutes, and Kemi Badenoch is still on her feet. Yeah. I think there was... for being in the room just there, one candidate stood out to me, and I wasn't thinking that I was going to come out and say this, but James Cleverly, I think, was the clear favourite amongst the Tories in the room. I think it was the best speech I think I've ever heard from him. I think he came across confident, he came across a bit like a normal person, as opposed to a little bit more stilted conversation that we've heard probably from Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick. I've been speaking to MPs and Tory members here over the past few days, trying to desperately figure out where this leadership race is going to go. And James, I think it's genuinely still all to play for. Yeah. I just don't quite know the way it's going to go. And people say it is just too close to call. Now, of course, in the next few days, the Tory leadership candidates will be whittled down from 4 down to 2. That will be done by the Tory members. And we've had most of the declarations from Tory MPs already. We haven't really had much movement in the last few days from them. We've not had a lot of people come out and say who they're going to be backing. So those people that have already said they're going to be backing someone, no, we've had no switches, we've had no real more endorsements. We've had one more MP endorsement for Tom Tugendhat, but that's about it. Now, speaking to the Tory members as well, I was struck by some more of the moderate candidates getting a little bit more of support. So there was much more support for James Cleverly than I thought, much more support for Tom Tugendhat. Now, that's not something you generally expect to hear from the Tory party conference, because we know, based on who they've voted for in the past, they tend to go for those more right-wing candidates. We generally thought that Kemi Badenoch, we thought that Robert Jenrick might be the more popular people here, but I genuinely think it is too close to call at this moment. Now, there's been a little bit of a talk behind the scenes about a potential deal to be done to try and knock Kemi Badenoch out of that final race. Now, will Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly team up to try and be that voice of the moderate wing of the party and try and knock them off? Now, some people here behind the scenes at the party conference believe that is going to happen. Those candidates will, of course, deny and say that they are ready to win this leadership race. There's not been a lot more polling either, James, of those Tory members, and we know they're a real slim majority in society, so it's hard to poll them. But what they have shown is that Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick still doing quite well. Kemi Badenoch still the front runner. So yes, I still think this race is all to play for. I still think it's quite wide open, and it's really hard to predict which way it's going to go in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it is. I'm harder than perhaps we thought it would be at this point. So 2 thoughts. The first is that the more we have seen of Badenoch and Jenrick, the madder they've looked. Whether you agree with that analysis or not, it's certainly a defensible observation in the context of making comments about civil servants being sent to jail or maternity pay having gone too far, or British special forces killing people illegally rather than imprisoning them or capturing them, something that Dominic Grieve, a former Attorney General, was incredibly condemning of on this programme yesterday with regard to Robert Jenrick's comments. And I mean, I've got 2 ghosts of leaders past in my mind, Natasha, and I bet you couldn't guess who they were. The first is Liz Truss. How much of a cautionary tale particularly for members is Liz Truss, the idea that, well, we quite like the look of we quite like the look, I don't want to say crazy, but we quite like the look of the extreme. I mean, but Truss has taught us to be very, very careful. And the second ghost is Cameron. I'll tell you why in a minute. But how much influence might the lessons of Liz Truss's regime have over the decision of members?
Look, we were here 2 years ago in Birmingham watching Liz Truss's government start to crumble. It was where it all fell down over that U-turn, Kwasi-Kwarteng, people running around, briefings everywhere. My memories of that pretty traumatic, to be quite honest. It's a bit triggering to be back here in Birmingham. But yes, there is a ghost of Liz Truss that has presided over this conference, and obviously she only gave her one speech. But I was surprised. Obviously, she got a lot of reaction in the room. Of course, if you're going to go to one of those events, you'd be keen keen to hear from her. But I was interested to hear, I interviewed Ben Houchen, the Tory mayor for Tees Valley yesterday. He was absolutely scathing about her, and speaking to many members behind the scenes, they are so ready and willing to draw a line under the Liz Truss era. And even you heard from Robert Jenrick on the stage just a few minutes ago talking about managed decline, essentially slagging off both of his recent predecessors from the main stage. Yes. Speaking of Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, this party conference was for them to lose.
Exactly that.
And they were always going to be the two front runners, and I think they are the two ones that have had quite a knock to their leadership campaigns by their comments about maternity and by those comments about the SAS.
Because of their own actions and their own interventions, not because of any punches being landed by their opponents. And that brings us to the ghost of David Cameron, because of course he went into conference very much trailing David Davis, which some people looking back may struggle to believe. And it was a speech on the conference stage that completely turbocharged David Cameron's leadership campaign, albeit he wasn't quite the rank outsider some people mistakenly recall. He had been anointed by Michael Howard. He had George Osborne by his side, people like Daniel, now Lord Finkelstein, very much in the camp. But that hasn't quite happened for any of these candidates here. It's more a case of two falling back from where they were before, and under your analysis, which is the only one I've seen so far, James Cleverly having a rather better time of it than everybody else.
If there was a David Cameron moment, then it was for James Cleverly to seize the stage today. I genuinely think that was the best speech that I've seen from him, and I think sometimes he does struggle. I've seen him where he struggled to keep a room together, where some of his language is absolutely bombed amongst a crowd, but I think that the speech on stage today was really pitch perfect from him. So I am very surprised that he has come out on top of my analysis today. But let's see how it lands, and let's see how Kemi Badenoch lands. She's just finishing up in the hall right now, getting what I can hear is quite a good reception. And like I say, she was the front runner. She has had a lot of Tory members and MPs here questioning whether they want to take the risk of Kemi Badenoch, right? She might be getting in the headlines. She might be saying what she believes are quite hard truths. But the fact is, she's going to get into rows. Her comments are going to be, quote, misrepresented. And she's going to really
you say
be
that,
quite
Natasha.
tough.
I mean, she's been very clear in the past that she never has to clarify anything she's said, and she never commits gaffes because she's so careful. I believe that interview was just one short week ago. Was it Harold Wilson who said that a week is a long time in politics? I wonder if she's changed her own mind about her own ability. And I don't know if you've seen this yet, but it's been reported by Bloomberg that she's running her leadership campaign from the home of a man who used to be in charge of the Institute of Economic Affairs. So,
oh no, it's the ghost of Liz Truss have come back again.
Yeah, well, also, of course, elements of hypocrisy over people who made much of Keir Starmer's use of properties owned by Lord Wahid Ali, which have been declared. And of course, I don't think Badenoch will have been required to declare this yet. So what are the odds? I'm going to tell you something that I shouldn't tell you. Do you remember when I told you that an extremely interesting source had suggested to me that Rishi Sunak was about to call a general election? And we were both quite dismissive, but you more than me.
I do remember. I remember that very vividly. It's something I tried to block out of my memory, but I unfortunately still remember it.
We didn't hold you to your promise to resign, if that turned out to be true. And for that, I think we're all grateful. But a very, very similar source has told me that they think it's going to be a Tugendhat Cleverly runoff.
Really?
What are the odds?
I don't think that's going to happen purely because of the
record.
amount of support that Robert Jenrick has amongst the MPs.
Yeah.
And Kemi Badenoch will say it's because he's been offering people jobs left, right and centre. But he has come out of the MP race incredibly well so far, and I don't imagine that support will be dropping off anytime soon. I think there is probably only room for one candidate on each side of the party on that.
Special forces stuff, that's going to have affected a lot of people who would have been leaning towards him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's really muddled this. And I was speaking to a source close to Ben Wallace about this last night, who said that, look, he is technically right in what he says about the SAS and making those decisions, but they're not the ones making those calls. It's the Secretary of State. It's the Prime Minister that's making those really key. It's got nothing to do with the boys and women and girls on the ground. So the source close to Ben Wallace said they really felt that Robert Jenrick has really muddled his words on that one. And you've seen it from Tom Tugendhat, and you've seen James Cleverly, and obviously those voices of authority, because they've been in the army, they've been in the armed forces, they know what it's like on the front line.
Yes.
And I think that's what you heard from, James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat on the stage today, both trumpeting their military services record, a clear dig.
And Jenrick has unwittingly reminded conference of that difference on their CVs. Final question, can you think of any reason why only one of the four Conservative candidates appears to have a mild obsession with me?
Yes. Robert Jenrick clearly is your biggest fan.
What am I doing wrong with the other three?
With you.
This is outrageous.
Well, I thought that Kemi may give a nod to you. If it's a joke that was going to be made, I would have thought that she was going to make it. But yes, clearly he's been spending a lot of time listening to LBC and clearly really loves your stuff.
Will you make sure he knows the number? 0345 6060 973. My door and indeed my phone lines are always open.
I'll let him know. I'll send a message to his team right now. So tell him whenever he wants to come on, he is more than willing to have a space on LBC to discuss whatever he wants with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if he wins. Natasha Clark, many thanks indeed. The time now is 12:46. Up next, James Graham, OBE, FRSL, to wax lyrical and call for the preservation of possibly the most iconic architecture, 20th century architecture that plays the biggest part in my childhood memories. 12:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention next to a rather different story that caught my eye yesterday. And I found it pulling my heartstrings in a slightly unexpected fashion. I went up on the train relatively recently to, I can't remember where I was on my way, but I went through East Midlands Parkway station, and the cooling towers that are part of the Ratcliffe-on-Soar power station are absolutely iconic. So my first home was in Doncaster. I grew up in a tiny little village called Burgh Wallace. Oddly enough, so did Jeremy Clarkson, of all people. So don't have a lot in common with Jeremy Clarkson, but we have that. And as a young person, as a child, a lot of my parents' best friends and my godparents all lived or remained in that part of the world. So whenever we travelled up there by road on the motorway, they were kind of like the mother of all milestones. But I hadn't realised until about a month ago, as the train pulled into that particular station, just what an emotional attachment I had to them. It was quite extraordinary. And then, of course, having registered the emotional attachment, I kind of clocked the extraordinary architectural impact. And that is why when I spotted a relatively little story in the Times yesterday about James Graham, the finest writer of his generation, most recently on your screens with Sherwood, but with a CV, as you'll gather if you listen to my full disclosure interview with him, a CV that is appallingly brilliant. He grew up in the shadow of these cooling towers and is therefore concerned about their imminent destruction. And James joins me now live from New York, where I presume you're winning awards and staging award-winning plays and doing all sorts of magical, amazing things, James.
Good morning. How you doing? I'm sorry, it's very la-di-da when I want to talk about industry in the East Midlands, and here I am doing a Broadway musical. I apologise.
Well, no, on the contrary, it's a real pleasure to have you here. But I can't really quite use the word campaign, can I, yet? Because all you've really done is express a hope and a desire. So this is the seed from which we hope a campaign might grow. But why the hope and the desire?
No, you're right. It's the beginning of a whinge that will hopefully turn into a moan that will eventually become a national conversation, I hope, about actually what we actually do to the physical remnants of our industrial heritage, which I think is really important. I'm very aware that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and these great hulking concrete towers aren't going to get everyone's heart a-fluttering. But I'm really glad they do yours, because like you, I whenever I go home to the East Midlands and those towers, these sentinels appear on the horizon, I get really, really emotional, partly because they are just so aesthetically beautiful. Yes. I think on the outside because of their scale, but also I was really lucky with Sherwood to get to go inside them. And when you walk into these, there's like a reverence that happens. You walk into these structures, like you say, that you can fit the entirety of St. Paul's in there, and they are like a dome. They're extraordinary, and no one ever gets to go inside them, and nobody will if we blow the last 45 of them up, which currently is the plan.
When would that,
like you say,
when would that plan be enacted? Do we know?
Well, there used to be 240 of them. Most of them have gone. So on Tuesday morning, it was a momentous day in the United Kingdom. We were the very first country in the world to begin powering ourselves with coal. That's right, yes. 142 years ago. And on Tuesday, we became the very first country in the world to stop. So it's a huge moment. But every power station now is obviously being decommissioned. And in the next couple of years, every single one of these towers will be blown up. And I just think, for the as much as I'm absolutely a supporter of transitioning to greener, energy efficient power, I think that's a really exciting moment. I don't see why that is a contradiction to want to leave some physical memory of a huge part of our national story. When people come to the UK in 100 years' time and go, this is where the Industrial Revolution started, was it the workshop of the world? Can I see any of that? And we'd be like, oh no, we blew it all up. There's nothing left. I'm sorry. I think that would be a huge shame.
I mean, some question over whether if it were a little bit more southern-centric, this architecture, there would be a rather more powerful case coming from some people to retain it.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I mean, I think if you look at the remnants of industry in the capital city, the Battersea Battersea Power Station, or near where I live in London, the gas canisters of Oval or in King's Cross, we build trendy apartment buildings around these in the capital city because we want to romanticize, I think, some link to our industrial heritage in the capital. But in the actual place where actual workers actually did these jobs, those people, those families, those workers don't get to keep those memories because I guess people just don't think people will notice if they're gone, but a lot of people locally will notice it. And it's definitely not simple either. Like the architects will tell you these weren't built to last. It will take an intervention and money to keep them up. But, the London Eye was only meant to last a year, and we managed to find the wherewithal and the desire to keep that going for all remembered time in the future. So I'm sure there's a way.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to lend themselves to the sort of gentrification that Battersea Power Station has enjoyed in recent years. They're not going to be full of multi-million-dollar flats or Chanel shopping outlets. But I went in. You see, you had the privilege of getting into the cooling tower. I actually had a look around Battersea Power Station when it was very much in decline, when it was a complete state, and the sense is similar. It's almost religious, isn't it? They're like cathedrals to the industrial past.
Absolutely, they're both on a level of memory, remembering that we used to build these kinds of structures and that we used to power ourselves, and we can be very proud of that heritage. But also, just architecturally, they are so beautiful. And when you think of a world where a glass skyscraper goes up every couple of seconds, these brick and stone and concrete structures, as much as they're not to everyone's taste, I think we will in 100 years really mourn them.
Most people are in agreement with you. Mike tells us that he spent 6 weeks working there in asbestos removal and would spend his lunch hour outside just gazing up at them in awe. But Denise tells me that she lives nearby, thinks they're an eyesore, and can't wait until they're razed to the ground.
That it is not universal, and we should listen to absolutely everybody. But speak to people in Sheffield. There were the Tinsley Towers that used to rise up on the M1. So as you entered Yorkshire on the raised viaduct of the M1, and you got to soar around these towers. People tried to save those in 2008. They didn't. They're gone now. All you get is a view of Meadow Hall. No disrespect to Meadow Hall. It's a great place to get your Christmas presents, but it does not, storytelling-wise, tell me anything about the North or the Midlands or our heritage. And so, it's in the eye of the beholder. I respect those viewpoints. Can we just keep a couple? That's all I want. It doesn't have to be 8. Can we just give a couple so that school children can stand in that footprint in years to come?
I think one in New Zealand has been turned into a bungee jumping centre, so you never know what new form they might take. While we have you, just for a minute more before you get back to rehearsals, what are you doing in New York? What are you rehearsing?
It is a musical which Elton John has written the songs for, and
I told you, honestly, interviewing this guy is just the most extraordinary. So what's that you say? Oh, Elton John, is it?
I'm sorry, he's an up-and-coming composer. I think good things for him in the future, and
he can't believe he's working with James Graham.
No, and he's a big fan of cooling towers and power stations, I believe. So I'm hoping he'll join the campaign.
What's it like doing a musical? How is it different from because Sherwood has just been wowing everybody on television screens, of course. But as a writer, what's the gear shift? What's the gear change?
Thank you. Yeah, it's just more. It's a collaboration. As a playwright or a screenwriter, it's just you. When you're doing a TV drama or a play, in a musical, you've got a choreographer doing tap dancing, and you've got a musical director teaching people songs, and you get to spread the stress. But you just feel less lonely, frankly. And I've got like 20 people tap dancing in a room next door, so it's really fun.
Well, we better let you get back to them, James Graham. It's such a pleasure to speak to you always, and again, I'm sort of quite moved by the fact that you are as moved. I know, a lot closer to your childhood than they are to mine, but these cooling towers, let's see what we can do to get behind attempts to save them. I'm going to end with something I've never done before. I'm going to end with a quote from Margaret Thatcher. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Robert Jenrick's daughter has Thatcher as a middle name. But she had a view on the relationship between journalists and politicians. She said in a speech to the Institute of Journalists, she said, "I'm bound to say that I'm reasonably satisfied with the traditional arrangement under which we politicians leave you journalists to get on with your job while you journalists tell us how to do ours. It's an arrangement which, for all its exasperations, is essential to the functioning of parliamentary democracy. Guardians of the public conscience you may be, and it is a noble role. Formers of public opinion you certainly are, but you are also, and it is in this that your value largely consists, you are also reflectors of the public mind. Without you, politicians would easily find themselves living in a cosy little world of their own imagining, blissfully ignorant, until too late, of what the people thought of them and of their policies." Margaret Thatcher there with some interesting thoughts. That's it from me for another day. You can, of course, rewind and listen back to all of the show on Global Player, where you can also pause all live radio and listen to a range of our podcasts. Download now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.